A humble mechanic repairs a stranded woman's boat for free, unaware that she is the owner of a luxury yacht empire. The sea has a way of calling lost souls home. Some people spend their whole lives chasing more wealth, more success, more control, only to realize too late that they've lost themselves in the process. Others, worn down by the world, retreat to solitude, hoping that silence will heal what was broken. This is a story about two such people. Lucas Reed walked away from everything, choosing the quiet isolation of an island where the only thing he fixed was broken boats, not broken hearts. Then there's Evelyn Carter, a woman who had everything yet felt nothing, a billionaire at the helm of a global yacht empire, searching for something she couldn't name. Fate led her to a storm, a broken-down boat, and a man who would change everything. What happens when two worlds that were never meant to meet suddenly collide? What if a simple act of kindness sets off a chain of events neither of them expected? And what if the very thing they were running from was exactly what they needed? This is The Lighthouse Between Us, a story of love, redemption, and second chances. Waves crashed gently against the rugged shoreline, their rhythmic melody filling the crisp morning air. The scent of salt and damp wood lingered as Lucas stepped out of his small, weathered cabin. Dressed in worn jeans and an old navy blue shirt, he ran a calloused hand through his graying hair and inhaled deeply, letting the quiet settle over him. Solitude wasn't a burden. It was a choice. For years, he had called this remote island home, living in sync with the tides, the wind, and the ever-changing sky. The outside world, with all its noise and expectations, had once held him captive, but he had left it behind. Here, among the broken boats and endless sea, he had found a fragile peace. Lucas made his way to the dock, where a half-repaired fishing boat rested on wooden beams. The island's fishermen relied on him to keep their vessels seaworthy, paying him with fresh fish, supplies, and the occasional bottle of whiskey. It was a simple trade, just enough to keep him connected, without tethering him to anyone. He was about to start working when something caught his eye. Out in the distance, a sleek white yacht bobbed on the water, its hull gleaming under the golden morning sun. Lucas frowned. Yachts rarely made it this far out. People who owned them preferred the comfort of private marinas and luxury resorts. But something was off. The yacht wasn't just drifting, it was tilting slightly, sluggish in the water, as if struggling. Lucas grabbed his binoculars from the tool bench and focused. The sails were down, the engine silent. A woman stood near the bow, waving something bright, a red scarf, a signal for help. With a sigh, Lucas set his tools down and climbed into his small motorboat. He wasn't the kind to welcome visitors, but he also wasn't the type to ignore someone in need. Starting the engine, he cut through the rolling waves, the salty spray hitting his face as he neared the yacht. As he pulled alongside, he got a better look at the woman. She was striking, not in a delicate, fragile way, but in the way she carried herself. Even from a distance, he saw the determination in her stance, the way she braced against the wind without hesitation. Her golden brown hair was tousled by the sea breeze, her linen pants and blouse slightly damp. But it was her eyes that caught him off guard, deep, intelligent, searching. "Thank God," she called out, her voice strong despite the worry in it. "My engine died and I have no signal out here. Can you help?" Lucas studied her for a moment before answering. "Depends. What happened?" She exhaled in relief, even though his tone wasn't exactly warm. "I was sailing alone, needed some time away. Something went wrong with the engine, and I lost power. I've been stuck for hours." Lucas eyed the pristine yacht skeptically. Not many people take a yacht like this out alone. What's your name? She hesitated, then gave a small, knowing smile. Evelyn, just Evelyn. Lucas didn't push. He didn't care who she was or where she came from. The sea had a way of stripping people down to their core, leaving only what truly mattered. All right, Evelyn, he said, securing a rope between their boats. Let's see what's wrong. She watched as he climbed aboard, his movements steady and sure. He was older than her, maybe early 40s, but there was something solid about him, something unshaken. Lucas crouched beside the engine panel, lifting the hatch with practiced ease. The moment he saw the tangled mess of wires, he let out a low whistle. Whoever last worked on this should be fired, he muttered. Evelyn chuckled despite herself. That bad? Bad enough that I'm surprised you made it this far. He worked in silence, his hands moving with the ease of someone who had spent years fixing things others had given up on. Evelyn found herself watching, not just what he did, but how he did it. There was a quiet confidence in him, a man who didn't waste words. Within 20 minutes, the engine sputtered back to life. Evelyn blinked. That's it? Lucas wiped his hands on a rag. That's it. She looked at him, genuine gratitude in her eyes. How much do I owe you? Lucas shook his head. Nothing. She frowned. Nothing? He leaned against the railing, eyes on the horizon. I don't charge for helping someone in trouble. The sea is unpredictable. Next time it might be me needing help. Evelyn studied him, her curiosity deepening. In her world, everything had a price. But here was a man who lived by a different code, one she didn't quite understand yet. Glancing at the island in the distance, she made a sudden decision. I don't suppose there's a place over there where I can get a meal. Lucas raised an eyebrow. You planning to stay? She shrugged, a playful glint in her eye. I figure I owe you dinner, at the very least. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt something close to a smile tug at his lips. Suit yourself. As he guided her yacht toward the shore, neither of them realized that this chance encounter would change their lives forever. The scent of salt and wood smoke lingered in the air as Lucas led Evelyn onto the island. The only sounds were the rhythmic lap of waves against the dock and the distant cries of seabirds. The sand was cool beneath their feet as they stepped onto the wooden pier, the old planks creaking under their weight. Evelyn took a deep breath, letting the raw, untamed beauty of the place sink in. It was a world apart from the polished perfection of luxury marinas and five-star resorts. Here, nature ruled, wild, unpredictable, and breathtakingly real. Lucas walked a few steps ahead, his posture relaxed but distant. He wasn't the type to fill silences with unnecessary words, and Stella found that intriguing. The men in her world were always eager to impress, their conversations carefully crafted to flatter or negotiate. But Lucas? He had no such intentions. She followed him past a row of small, rustic boat houses to a cabin that stood slightly apart from the others. It was simple, weathered wood, an old porch lined with fishing nets, and a lantern hanging by the door. Warm light glowed softly from inside, the only sign of comfort in an otherwise rugged landscape. Lucas pushed the door open and stepped aside, silently inviting her in. Stella hesitated for just a moment before stepping across the threshold. The interior was exactly what she expected, functional, minimal, but strangely comforting. The air carried the scent of aged timber, salt, and something unexpected, cinnamon. A small stove crackled in the corner, a pot simmering on top. A well-worn bookshelf lined one wall, its books clearly read more than once. Maps, old compasses, and nautical instruments were scattered across a wooden desk by the window. You live here alone? She asked, running her fingers along the bookshelf's edge. Lucas set his keys down on the table. Yeah. She glanced around, curiosity growing. For how long? He lifted the lid of the pot, stirring its contents before answering. Almost 10 years. Stella blinked. 10 years? She had expected a few months, maybe a year, a temporary escape. But a decade? That wasn't just running from the world, that was choosing a new one. What made you stay? She asked. Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he ladled stew into 2 bowls and placed one in front of her. Steam rose between them as he finally replied, "Didn't see much reason to leave." It was vague on purpose. She recognized a deflection when she saw one, but she also knew better than to push too hard, too fast. Instead, she took a sip of the stew, rich, warm, and spiced just enough to linger on her tongue. "This is unexpectedly good," she admitted. Lucas gave a slight shrug. "Cooking's just another kind of fixing. Same principles apply." She smiled. "So you fix things, boats, meals, what else?" For the first time, amusement flickered across Lucas's otherwise unreadable face. Not much else worth fixing. The silence between them was comfortable, natural. 2 strangers from different worlds, bound together for this one simple moment. Stella set her spoon down and leaned back slightly. "You didn't ask me why I was out there alone." Lucas met her gaze, his expression neutral. "Didn't seem like my business." She studied him. Most people would have asked by now, probing for details, weaving assumptions. But Lucas, he didn't need to know, and that, oddly enough, made her want to tell him. "I needed to get away," she admitted. "From everything." Lucas didn't react, didn't press for more. He simply nodded as if that answer was enough. But for Stella, it wasn't. For years, she had fought to build a global luxury yacht empire, proving herself in an industry dominated by men. She had earned power, success, respect. But somewhere along the way, the emptiness crept in, slow at first, then all at once. It was in the endless board meetings, the hollow conversations at exclusive galas, the relentless need to always be more. But out there, on the open water, with nothing but the horizon stretching before her, she had felt something close to freedom, until her engine failed, and fate brought her here. She met Lucas's gaze again. Something told her he recognized that feeling, the need to escape. Maybe he had once felt it himself. The thought unsettled her more than it should have. "So," she said, shifting the conversation, "how do you spend your days here?" Lucas leaned back slightly. "Fixing boats, fishing when I feel like it, reading." She raised an eyebrow. "Reading?" He gestured toward the bookshelf. "Got plenty of time." Stella wandered over, scanning the titles: Hemingway, Melville, Steinbeck, and, to her surprise, poetry. "You read poetry?" she asked, amused. Lucas didn't flinch. "Sometimes." She pulled a book from the shelf, flipping through the worn pages. "Any favorites?" For a long moment he said nothing. Then, just as she thought he wouldn't answer, he spoke. "The cure for anything is salt water, sweat, tears, or the sea." Stella paused. She knew that quote. Isak Dinesen. She turned back to him, but he had already stood, gathering the empty bowls. The conversation was over, and she didn't mind. Because something told her Lucas Kane was not a man to be figured out in a single night. For the first time in a long time, that intrigued her. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the island, stretching its light across the calm waters. Stella stood barefoot on the wooden dock, coffee cup in hand, watching as Lucas worked on a fishing boat a few yards away. His movements were methodical, practiced, like a man who had spent a lifetime fixing things. She had only planned to stay one night. Just a quick stop before heading back to the world she had built. But something about this place, about him, made her hesitate. And now, on her second morning here, she found herself reluctant to leave. Lucas barely acknowledged her as he worked, his focus entirely on the boat. Stella had never met a man so comfortable in silence. In her world, people filled every pause with words, negotiations, pleasantries, distractions. But Lucas? He didn't waste breath on unnecessary conversation. Strangely, she found it refreshing. "You always this talkative?" she finally asked, smirking as she took a sip of her coffee. Lucas glanced up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Only when there's something worth saying." She chuckled, shaking her head. And here I was, thinking we were bonding. Lucas didn't smile, but something flickered in his eyes. "You staying or leaving?" It was a simple question, but it caught her off guard. She had spent years making decisions that affected thousands, investments, expansions, partnerships. Yet, this one moment of self-reflection felt strange, difficult. "I haven't decided," she admitted, surprising herself with her honesty. Lucas nodded as if he had expected that answer. "Then make yourself useful." She raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" He gestured toward a stack of wooden planks near the dock. "If you're gonna hang around, you can help. That boat's not gonna fix itself." Stella laughed. "You want me to work? You want breakfast?" Her amusement deepened. "So this is a trade system?" "Something like that." She looked at him for a long moment. Then, before she could overthink it, she set her coffee down and walked toward the planks. "All right, Kane. Let's see if I'm cut out for island life." As the morning stretched into afternoon, Stella found herself knee-deep in sawdust, learning how to sand wooden panels. It was painstaking, repetitive work, but there was something oddly satisfying about it. Watching the rough surface transform beneath her hands into something smooth, something finished. Lucas, ever the quiet observer, occasionally corrected her technique, but offered little in the way of encouragement. "You're terrible at this," he remarked, after her fifth failed attempt at getting the angle right. Stella shot him a glare. "Encouraging," she muttered. He shrugged. "You own a yacht empire. Didn't think you'd know much about building them?" She scoffed. "I know plenty about boats." Lucas leaned against the railing, arms crossed. "All right, what's the first thing you check on a damaged hull?" Stella opened her mouth, then shut it. She knew financial projections, fleet logistics, and brand marketing like the back of her hand. But the mechanics? Not so much. Lucas smirked. "Thought so." She exhaled, dropping the sandpaper. "Fine, you win. But in my defense, I usually pay people to know that stuff." Lucas nodded, picking up a hammer. "That's the problem." His words hit harder than she expected. For years, she had surrounded herself with experts, delegating every detail to specialists. Efficiency and control had built her empire. But here, on this small island, none of that mattered. Here, survival wasn't about delegation. It was about knowing. And for the first time, she was realizing just how much she didn't know. As the afternoon stretched on, dark clouds gathered on the horizon. Lucas looked up from his work, frowning. Storm's coming. Stella followed his gaze, her stomach tightening at the sight. How bad? Bad enough. He set down his tools. "Come on, we need to tie things down." The easy rhythm of the day shifted to urgency. They moved quickly, securing boats, reinforcing the dock, gathering supplies. Stella mimicked Lucas's movements as best she could, though her fingers fumbled as she worked. The wind picked up fast, whipping her hair into her face. The waves, once steady, now crashed against the shore with growing force. Lucas handed her a rope. "Tie this off. Make it tight." She took it, struggling to secure the knot as the wind howled around them. The rope slipped through her grasp, and she swore under her breath. Before she could try again, Lucas was beside her, his hands steady as he covered hers, guiding her through the motion. His grip was firm, his skin rough, his presence unwavering. "There," he said, stepping back. "Now it won't come loose." Stella swallowed, suddenly aware of how close they were. The storm raged around them, but for a fleeting moment, all she could focus on was the man before her. Lucas met her gaze, and for the first time since she'd arrived, she saw something unguarded in his expression. It was brief, barely there, but it was enough to make her breath catch. Then, just as quickly, he turned away. "Come inside. It's about to hit." And just like that, the moment was gone. The storm crashed into the island with full force as they stepped into Lucas's cabin. Wind howled against the wooden walls, rain pounded in relentless sheets, and the lantern flickered, casting long shadows across the room. Stella wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the chill. "How long do these storms usually last?" she asked. Lucas stoked the fire in the stove. "Could be a few hours, could be all night." She exhaled, sinking into the chair across from him. The wind screamed outside, making the cabin feel impossibly small. Lucas handed her a dry blanket. "Here." She took it without a word, draping it over her shoulders. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the storm outside. Then quietly, Lucas broke the silence. "You're not just running from the world, are you?" The question caught her off guard. She met his gaze, heart pounding. He wasn't just making conversation, he saw through her. For years, she had kept her walls high, convinced no one could see past them. But Lucas, he saw straight through her. She swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. So she said nothing. And for once, silence felt like the most honest answer of all. The storm raged on, howling through the trees, rattling the windows, hammering the roof with relentless rain. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of burning wood. The fire flickered, throwing shadows across the wooden walls. Stella sat near the stove, fingers gripping the blanket tighter than necessary. She wasn't sure what unsettled her more, the storm outside or the one brewing inside her. Across from her, Lucas sat in his usual silence, one hand wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. He wasn't looking at her, but she could feel his presence, solid, steady, like an anchor in the chaos. She hadn't answered his question earlier, and he hadn't asked again. After what felt like an eternity, she cleared her throat. "How bad does it usually get?" Lucas glanced toward the rattling window. "Bad enough, but it'll pass." His voice was calm, certain, like storms were just another part of life, something to endure, something temporary. She envied that certainty. Pulling the blanket tighter, she stared at the fire. "You weren't surprised when I said I was out there alone." Lucas took a slow sip of coffee. "Didn't seem like something that surprised you either." She let out a slow breath. "No, I suppose not." The truth was, loneliness had been a constant companion for years. People assumed wealth and power meant a life filled with people. Friends, lovers, admirers. But the higher she climbed, the fewer people she could truly trust. Conversations became transactions. Relationships became strategic. Vulnerability became a weakness she couldn't afford. She glanced at Lucas. He was different. There was no pretense with him, no hidden agenda, just silence, honesty, and a quiet strength that unsettled her in ways she hadn't expected. A sudden gust of wind slammed against the cabin, making Stella flinch. Lucas stood, moving toward the window. "It's shifting," he muttered. Lucas didn't glance up. "Storm's over. No point in waiting around." She exhaled, rubbing her arms. The island had returned to its eerie calm, but between them, a different kind of tension lingered. The kind that had nothing to do with the weather, and everything to do with last night. The way he had shielded her, the way he had held on to her just a little too long, and the way she hadn't wanted to pull away. She turned toward the broken window, gazing out at the ocean. "Does this happen often?" Lucas set down the beam. "Storms?" She glanced over her shoulder. "I meant nights like last night." His hands stilled, just for a fraction of a second, before he resumed working. "Not like that." Something in his voice made her chest tighten. Stella had spent her life surrounded by men who spoke in circles, executives, politicians, businessmen who mastered the art of saying nothing at all. But Lucas, he said little, but when he did, it was never empty. The silence stretched between them before Stella finally turned away. "I should probably head back soon." Lucas didn't react. "I'll check your engine again." That should have been the end of it. A clean break, an easy exit. But she didn't move. Because the truth was, she wasn't ready to leave. They worked in silence for the next hour, Lucas repairing, Stella helping where she could. It was an unspoken rhythm, strange yet natural. At one point, she stepped outside to stretch her legs, wandering toward the dock where her yacht was moored. She ran her fingers along the railing, contemplating the life that waited for her beyond this island. Then she heard it. A voice, male, low, unfamiliar. She turned sharply, spotting a group of men at the far end of the dock. Fishermen, judging by their weathered faces and sturdy builds. They were speaking in hushed voices, but one word caught her attention, her name. Not just Stella, her full name. She froze. "Stella Harrington, right? The one with the yacht company?" The words sent a jolt through her, sharp, immediate. Lucas, standing a few feet away, straightened. The fishermen turned, their curiosity plain. Recognition flickered in Lucas's eyes, and just like that, the fragile balance between them shattered. Lucas stared at her for a long moment, unreadable as ever. But something had shifted. The easy silence between them was gone, replaced by something colder. "You own Harrington Yachts?" It wasn't a question. She exhaled. "Yes." Lucas's jaw tightened. He turned back toward the cabin, dismissing the conversation entirely. Stella took a step forward. "It changes things, doesn't it?" He didn't answer. She huffed, frustration creeping in. "Of course it does." Lucas finally stopped. He turned, his voice calm, too calm. "You expected it not to?" She swallowed. "I didn't lie to you. You didn't tell me the truth either." Silence. Stella had spent her life controlling conversations, steering them where she wanted. But Lucas was different. He didn't argue. He didn't lash out. He simply saw. And somehow, that was worse. She forced herself to meet his gaze. "Does it matter?" Lucas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "You think I don't know what companies like yours do?" A chill ran through her. "What are you talking about?" His voice was quieter now, but heavier. "My father was a fisherman. He lost everything when one of your luxury fleets expanded into his waters. Couldn't compete. Couldn't afford the new licenses. He went under. A year later, he was gone." The words landed like a punch. Stella's breath hitched. She opened her mouth, then closed it. She had never thought about it, never considered the ripple effects of what her company did beyond the glossy brochures and billion-dollar deals. "I didn't know." she whispered. Lucas let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a laugh. No, you didn't. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Stella standing alone, the ocean stretching before her, vast and unforgiving. A year later, he was gone. Stella had spent years negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts, building an empire from the ground up. But she had never once thought about the fisherman left behind in the wake of her success. Stella Harrington wasn't accustomed to guilt. She was used to control, to having answers. But this was unfamiliar territory. She tightened her grip on the wheel. Maybe leaving had been the right choice. Maybe it had been the only choice. But why did it feel like she was running away from something she wasn't ready to lose? By the time she reached the marina, her world was already waiting. A sleek black car was parked at the dock, and the moment she stepped off the yacht, her assistant, Evelyn, rushed toward her. "Miss Harrington, thank God. We've been trying to reach you for days. You had a board meeting scheduled." "Cancel anything that isn't urgent," Stella interrupted, running a hand through her wind-tangled hair. "I need time." Evelyn blinked. "Time for what?" To think, to breathe, to understand why leaving that island felt like leaving a piece of herself behind. But instead, Stella simply sighed. "Just reschedule the meetings." Evelyn hesitated before nodding, falling into step beside her as they walked toward the car. "Oh, and there's been some media chatter. Someone spotted your yacht near an uncharted island. The press is speculating." Stella clenched her jaw. "Ignore it." Evelyn's eyes flickered with curiosity, but she knew better than to ask. "Of course." As the car pulled away from the dock, Stella glanced back at the water, half expecting, half hoping to see a small, weathered boat trailing behind. But there was nothing. Lucas was gone, and she had no reason to return. Stella's penthouse was exactly as she had left it. Pristine, luxurious, and cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline, but after days on the island, it all felt artificial. She poured herself a glass of wine and sank into the leather couch, kicking off her shoes. The familiar surroundings should have comforted her. They didn't. Her phone buzzed. A message from her CFO finalized the acquisition deal. "We're expanding into the South Atlantic. Contracts ready for your approval." Her stomach twisted. The South Atlantic. More waters claimed for luxury yachts. More fishermen like Lucas's father forced out. She set the phone down like it burned her. Was this what success had come to? Was this what she had fought for? The worst part was, Lucas was right. She had spent so long building her empire, ensuring she was untouchable, that she had never stopped to ask who was paying the price for it. She took a slow sip of wine, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in her life, victory felt hollow. Days passed, but the island lingered in her mind. She saw it in the stillness of early mornings when the city hadn't fully woken. She heard it in the distant crash of waves against the harbor, and she felt it every time she closed her eyes. She dreamed of rough hands guiding hers over a fraying rope, the scent of sawdust and sea salt, the warmth of a fire flickering in a storm. Lucas. She told herself it was ridiculous. She had known him for only a handful of days. He was a man who had cut himself off from the world, who had no reason to trust her. But somehow, she couldn't forget the way he had looked at her, not as Stella Harrington, CEO, but just Stella. And she wasn't sure she had ever truly been seen before. One evening, as she sat on her balcony, staring out at the endless stretch of ocean, Evelyn approached with a folder in hand. "Miss Harrington, I need you to sign off on the South Atlantic acquisition." Stella didn't move. Evelyn hesitated. "Should I leave it here?" A long silence. Then, Stella took the folder, running her fingers over the crisp edges. The weight of the decision pressed down on her. For the first time in years, she didn't immediately sign. Instead, she whispered, almost to herself, "What if we did something different?" Evelyn frowned. Different how? Stella turned, her mind suddenly clear. She didn't know how, not yet. But she knew one thing. She needed to go back. The warm Miami breeze drifted through the open balcony doors, but Stella barely felt it. The folder in her hands, the South Atlantic acquisition, sat heavy on her lap, a stark reminder of everything she had built and everything she might have destroyed along the way. For days, she had turned the decision over in her mind. Every logical part of her knew the answer: sign the papers, expand the business, win. It was what she had always done. It was what made her one of the most powerful women in the industry. But then she thought of Lucas, his father, the fishermen who had lost their livelihoods, their homes, because of decisions just like this one. And suddenly, winning didn't feel like enough anymore. Evelyn knocked softly before stepping onto the balcony. "Miss Harrington, the board is expecting your final approval on the deal." Stella ran a hand through her hair, exhaling slowly. "What happens to the local fishermen if we take this expansion?" Evelyn hesitated. "Well, I assume some of them would be displaced. We'd be buying out independent ports, replacing them with high-end marinas for our clients." Stella already knew the answer, but hearing it out loud made it harder to ignore. She glanced at the folder again. She had spent years making calculated choices, ensuring her empire thrived, but she had never considered the names and faces of those left in the shadows of her success. Until now. "What if," she said slowly, "instead of taking their waters, we worked with them?" Evelyn frowned. "I don't understand." Stella stood suddenly, feeling like she had been asleep for years and had only just woken up. "What if we partnered with the fishermen? Created programs to help them keep their businesses instead of wiping them out?" Evelyn blinked. "You mean charity?" "No," Stella said firmly. "Investment." Evelyn hesitated before choosing her words carefully. "With all due respect, the board won't go for this. The shareholders expect growth, not goodwill." Stella met her gaze. "Then we give them both." For the first time in a long time, Stella felt something she hadn't in years: purpose. And just like that, she knew what she had to do. The next day, Stella found herself standing in a place she had never set foot in before, a small fishing port on the outskirts of the city, a world away from the luxury marinas she had built. As she walked along the weathered planks of the dock, the fishermen eyed her with wary curiosity. Her designer heels clicked against the wood, a sharp contrast to the rough boots and calloused hands surrounding her. She didn't belong here, and they knew it. She stopped when she spotted an older man hunched over a fishing net, repairing it by hand. His skin was bronzed from years under the sun, his fingers rough with labor. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you the dockmaster?" The man looked up, his sharp gaze sweeping over her. "Depends on who's asking." She extended a hand. "Stella Harrington." He didn't take it. Instead, recognition flickered in his expression. "You're the yacht lady." She exhaled. "That's one way to put it." The man snorted. "What's a billionaire doing in a place like this? Looking to buy us out, too." A month ago, she might have. But now, she shook her head. "Number, I want to help." He let out a dry laugh. "That's a new one." Stella crouched so they were at eye level. "What if I told you my company could work with you instead of against you? What if we funded programs to modernize your boats, invested in your trade, and made sure your communities weren't pushed out." The man narrowed his eyes. "And why the hell would you do that?" She thought of Lucas, of his father, of all the lives upended because people like her had never bothered to ask that question. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said simply. The dockmaster studied her for a long moment before shaking his head with a small chuckle. "Well, I'll be damned." Stella left the docks that day with something she'd never found in a boardroom, a purpose. She was done chasing profit for the sake of power. Now she was going to fight for something real. And the first person she needed to convince wasn't her board. It was Lucas. "You actually did this, I did." Silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't cold. It was something else, something shifting. Finally, Lucas leaned back, studying her with the same intensity as the first time they had met. "And you came here," he murmured, "because you wanted me to know she swallowed. I came here because I wanted you to believe me." Lucas held her gaze for a long moment, then exhaled a slow measure. "Breath. Damn it, Harrington," he muttered. And this time when he looked at her, really looked at her, it wasn't with anger. It was something else entirely. Lucas had always believed that people didn't change, not really. They adapted, they adjusted, but at their core, they remained who they had always been. But as he sat across from Stella, flipping through the pages of the proposal she had placed before him, he realized maybe he had been wrong, because the woman standing in his cabin now wasn't the same Stella Harrington who had arrived on the island days ago, stranded on a broken yacht. This Stella had fought battles. He couldn't see battles against a world that thrived on power and control, against a system she had once built, but now wanted to rewrite, and the worst part, he wanted to believe her. The fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. Stella sat opposite him, her posture steady, her expression unreadable, but Lucas had learned to recognize the quiet determination in her eyes. "Why are you really here?" he finally asked. Closing the folder, she exhaled. "I told you. I want you to see what I'm trying to do. That's not what I meant." Silence stretched between them. Lucas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. "You could have sent this in an email. You didn't need to come all the way back here." Stella looked down for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Then, when she finally met his gaze again, her voice was softer. "I needed to see you." The admission was quiet, almost hesitant. Lucas studied her, feeling the weight of those words settle between them. For years he had lived on this island, convinced that distance was the only way to keep himself from getting hurt again. But here she was, someone who should have been his opposite in every way, standing on the other side of that divide, and for the first time in years, he didn't want to push her away. "Come with me," he said, suddenly standing. Stella blinked, where he grabbed his jacket and nodded toward the door. "You want me to believe you? Let's take a walk." She hesitated only a moment before. Nodding, they stepped outside, the salty breeze rolling in from the ocean. The storm had left its mark, broken branches littered the shoreline. The dock still bore signs of the fierce winds, but the island itself remained steady, much like Lucas, much like her in a way she was only now beginning to understand. They walked in silence at first, past the familiar stretch of beach, where they had first met, past the boats Lucas had spent years repairing. Then, as they reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the sea, Lucas finally spoke. "My dad used to take me here when I was a kid," he said, his voice distant before things got bad. Stella glanced at him, surprised he rarely spoke about his past. She waited, letting him take his time. He loved the ocean. Said it was the only place where everything made sense. Lucas let out a slow breath. "Then we lost everything, the fishing business, the house. He never recovered from it." She swallowed hard. I'm sorry. Lucas shook his head. It's not about apologies, it's about knowing that what you do, what your company does, it affects real people, not just numbers on a report, I know that. Now she said softly, I should have known it sooner. He turned to face her. And you really think you can change it? She met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, the wind whipped around them, the waves crashing below, and for the first time Lucas believed her. They made their way back toward the cabin. The silence between them no longer heavy, but something else entirely. Something unfinished when they reached the porch. Stella had hesitated. This isn't just about the company, is it? Lucas asked quietly. She let out a breath. No. Lucas stepped closer. He wasn't a man of grand gestures, wasn't someone who needed flowery words to understand what was happening. He had spent years shutting the world out, but standing in front of Stella. Now he knew one thing for certain. Some things were worth letting in. Stay, he murmured. Stella's heart pounded for how long Lucas gave a small, almost amused smirk. Guess we'll figure that out together. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Stellan knew. She wasn't leaving this time. The island was different at dusk. Golden light stretched across the water, casting shimmering reflections that made the waves look almost like liquid fire. The air smelled of salt and fresh earth, and the only sound was the distant call of seabirds and the gentle lapping of the tide against the dock. Lucas stood at the edge of the beach, his hands in his pockets, watching Stella as she moved along the shoreline. She had been here for a few days now, longer than either of them had planned, and yet neither had spoken about what came next for a man who had spent years living in solitude. Lucas found himself strangely at ease with her presence. She fit into his world in a way that shouldn't have made sense, but somehow it did. Even now, as she kneeled beside an old wooden boat, running her fingers along its hull with a thoughtful expression, he found himself watching her. Not with skepticism, but with something he wasn't ready to name. You think it'll hold? Stella asked, nodding toward the boat. Lucas smirked, stepping closer. You doubting my work? She glanced up at him. Amusement in her eyes I wouldn't dare. The boat was one of the last remaining from the old fisherman who had once made a living here. The paint had faded, the wood weathered by years of exposure, but it still stood a symbol of what once was and maybe of what could be. Again, she ran a hand over the worn planks. You said your father believed the ocean made sense. Lucas nodded. Yeah. She met his gaze. Then let's give it back to the people who need it. Lucas studied her, waiting for her to explain. Stella stood brushing sand off her hands. I don't just want to change my company's approach. I want to start something real, a program that works with fishermen, not just to preserve what they have, but to expand it. New boats, new techniques, sustainable fishing training for the next generation. Lucas raised an eyebrow. You just come up with that. That, she grinned. No, I've been thinking about it for days. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head. You really don't give up? Do you not when something's worth fighting for? A pause. Then he nodded. All right, he said, let's do it. The next morning they got to work. Lucas had spent years repairing boats, but this was different. This wasn't just fixing something broken. It was building something new. They stripped the old boat down, assessing what could be salvaged and what needed replacing. Stella worked alongside him, hands covered in sword dust, sweat beading at her temples. She wasn't afraid of the work, and Lucas found that he respected that. More than anything, at one point, she wiped her forehead with the back of her arm and smirked. I think I'm getting the hang of this. Lucas glanced at the uneven nails she had hammered in and chuckled. Sure you are. She swatted his arm. Laughing, it was easy, natural, and for a moment Lucas let himself forget that this wasn't a life she was meant for that. Sooner or later she'd have to go back that night after the tools were put away and the fire crackled inside the cabin. Stella sat on the porch watching the waves. Lucas stepped outside, 2 mugs of coffee in hand. He handed her one, then leaned against the railing beside her. "You really think this will work?" he asked. She took a coffee. "I do." He nodded, staring out at the water. "You could have just gone back to your life and forgotten about all this." Stella exhaled. "I tried." Lucas turned to her, and she met his gaze, something unreadable in her expression, and I realized I didn't want a silence stretched between them thick with something unspoken. Then Lucas looked back at the ocean. "You see that out there?" He pointed toward a distant light flickering in the darkness. A lighthouse, she guessed. He nodded. "It's been there forever. Ships use it to find their way." Stella tilted her head. "Is this a metaphor?" Lucas smirked. Maybe. She glanced back at the lighthouse, the steady glow standing firm against the black sea, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had found her own beacon in the dark, a reason to stay, a reason to fight, and maybe a reason to love. The first light of dawn painted the sky in soft hues of gold and lavender. The ocean stretched endlessly before them, calm and infinite, as if the storm that had once raged both in the skies and in their lives had never existed. Stella stood on the dock, the salty Brie Cayenne tousling her hair, her hands resting on the smooth railing of the newly restored boat. It was finally ready. Lucas stepped up beside her, hands in his pockets, his gaze following the gentle rise and fall of the waves. "She's seaworthy," he said. Nodding toward the boat took longer than I thought, but it'll hold. Stella turned to him, a small smile playing at her lips. "It's beautiful." He smirked. "It's functional." She laughed softly. Same thing for weeks. They had worked side by side, rebuilding more than just a boat. They had built a future, one neither of them had expected, and today was the day they set it into motion. The island's fishermen had gathered on the shore, their faces lined with curiosity and cautious hope. Some of them had lost everything to the changing tides of the industry, victims of corporations like Stellar. But today, they weren't losing anything. Today, they were getting it back. Stella stepped forward, holding the thick rope that secured the boat to the dock. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice steady. "We start here with one boat, one community, and from here we grow the dock." Master, the same man who had once met her with suspicion, crossed his arms and nodded. "You're serious about this?" She met his gaze completely. Lucas, standing beside her, added, "She doesn't do anything." Halfway the dock. Master chuckled. "Guess we'll see about that then." With a small nod, he took the rope from her hands and tied the final knot, a symbol of trust, of something new, as the last of the fishermen drifted back to their boats. Lucas turned to Stella. "So what now?" She inhaled deeply, letting the salty air fill her lungs. "Now I go back." Lucas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "Thought you might?" She looked at him, then really looked at him, the man who had saved her during the storm, the man who had challenged her to see beyond her world, the man who had, without meaning to, made her feel more than she had in years. "I'm not going back to leave," she said softly. Lucas tilted his head, studying her. Then why? She smiled, because there's still work to do. And she had a company to reshape, partnerships to build, promises to keep. She had spent years building an empire. Now it was time to build something meaningful. Lucas exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck, and after that, her smile widened. "Then I come back." A beat of silence. Then, to her surprise, Lucas smiled too. They stood at the edge of the dock, the world stretching wide before them. This place changes people, Lucas murmured. Stella glanced at him. It changed you. He hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. She reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. It changed me too. Lucas looked down at their joined hands, then at her. You sure you're coming back? She squeezed his finger gently. I don't belong in just one world anymore. And for the first time, Lucas believed her. The boat rocked gently in the water, waiting for its maiden voyage. Lucas exhaled, shaking his head with a small smile. Guess I'll be here, she smirked. Guess you will. The sun rose higher, casting golden light over the island, over the ocean, over them. And as Stella stepped onto her yacht set, getting a course for a future she was ready to rewrite, she knew one thing for certain. Some journeys don't end. They just find new horizons. And that, my friends, is the story of the lighthouse between us, a journey of love, redemption,